What's up, guys? It's John Dominique, the Soul Proponent. Today, I want to talk a little bit about becoming a spiritual practitioner and some of the things that we go through during the process of spiritual awakening. Becoming a spiritual practitioner is a lifelong, full-time journey. They call it a practice because we have to actually do something. More like, to be more accurate, is we have to undo something. And what we have to undo is this identity of who we think we are that we've accumulated throughout our life. We've picked up all these ideas, these concepts, our hopes and desires of who and what we want to be, what we want to happen, the outcome of our lives. And we do this to escape a sense of nothingness, of emptiness, of feeling of no value. So the tendency to hang on to this identity, to be attached, to be fixated, and to be obsessed with building this identity, concretizing it, making it into something solid that we can hang on to, is embedded deeply into the core, into the fabric of our awareness, of our consciousness. It's difficult to think how we could ever shake this tendency or this attachment and this fixation. Just to even be aware of it is a huge step. So we need to become a spiritual practitioner and study ourselves, because we've lost touch with a part of ourselves that we left behind in childhood. And this is like the young, innocent part of us that we were close to as children. We were naturally very close to this part of us. We didn't have really much the need to hang on to an alternate identity of who we want ourselves to be. And this personality, this ego identity, wasn't so prevalent in our lives. It didn't have such a stronghold on us. So the process of becoming a spiritual practitioner is like a recovery. It's like a recovery process of getting back to the way we were when we were children. And getting back to the way we were as children brings us closer to the source of our goodness, our wholeness, our health, our well-being. There's a lot of resistances to being a spiritual practitioner and this recovery process. The resistances to self-study mainly is the instinct to avoid, to deflect, to resist self-study. The ego identity, the personality, is the actual resistance, and we're attached to this resistance. And as you walk the path, you can just notice for yourself how much we resist the purity of being. Because if we were to just purely be, we wouldn't have any activity. Our minds wouldn't be thinking. On an unconscious level, the mind continues to think because it's grasping, it's groping, it's desperate to have something to hold on to, something to fixate itself on. And we need to see how much of a resistance the activity of thinking is to pure being. There's a lot of other resistances. The resistances are numerous and they're fierce. It's very difficult to become a spiritual practitioner because it takes a lot of work consistently, and it's painful. No one really wants to do what's required because it's the nature of the task is treacherous, and there's a lot of failure to it. But if we're compassionate and we know ahead of time about the failures, that there's going to be plenty of failures, that we have to continue on despite how difficult it is to traverse the path of the truth and the path of the soul, then it'll make things easier if we're aware of that. So that's kind of what I'm here for, to help people on the journey, to make them aware of the things that they can expect if they attempt to walk the path to the soul. One of the big resistances to spiritual practice is judgment. What'll happen is the ego identity, it'll have the tendency to judge. It'll judge the path as selfish, especially. Like the people around us, we've heard all these messages that it's selfish to take the time that you need for yourself, to actually examine yourself and to do what's necessary for your own well-being. It's always something more important. It's more important to be a good Christian, to follow the rules, to not challenge the status quo, not to rock the boat, to help everyone else feel safe and comfortable. It'll judge, this ego identity will judge us as selfish for taking the path to the soul, because it is very lonely and you have to go by yourself into the woods, off in a distance like Jesus did. And that's not a conducive way to be for survival's sake. The herd mentality requires that we group together, we stay together. And that's how the path to the, resistance to the path to the soul is part of the resistance. Taking on the herd mentality and allowing that to dominate, to be more important than the path to the soul. So we have to be willing to challenge this type of judgment that's being selfish. We have to say, maybe it's selfish for calling me selfish to take the path to the soul. That's really what's really selfish. Trying to block someone, trying to shame someone, trying to ridicule them and mock them for actually doing what's necessary for their own health and for their own self-worth, to be able to feel their own self-worth. And it does more damage in the long run by resisting taking the path to the soul than it does by actually taking the path to the soul despite the consequences. Another resistance to self-study and resistance to being a spiritual practitioner is the feeling that it won't do any good. It's kind of hopeless. And we have to examine this and embrace this fully. The feeling that it won't do any good. Maybe it won't do any good, especially at the beginning. We're going to have to understand that there's not going to be very much progress. It takes a grit and a determination to allow the failures to be there and to allow the pain and have compassion for ourselves in our process. We don't have any control over it. If we're not compassionate with ourselves, if we're not willing to continue despite the obstacles and the barriers, then likely it won't happen for us. So we have to grow a thick skin, kind of. And the thought that it won't do any good, we have to examine that, because, you know, we have to get to the place where we don't want anything good to happen, or we don't want anything bad not to happen. That's kind of the middle ground. And the middle path is always the best way. We want truth more than we want something good. That's kind of the mentality we have to have, the kind of attitude, the little twist. It's a little shift in the way we think about things, walking this path to the soul. That's how our spiritual practice affects us. We want the truth in its entirety. We don't want something good. We don't want to avoid something bad. The truth has to prevail at all times, love for the truth. So thinking that taking the path of the soul won't do any good, we have to see that that's a resistance, a barrier, an obstacle. We have to be willing to lose everything, including our attachment to belief that walking the path won't do any good. We have to let go of that as well. It's a tall order, but it's possible. And another resistance that I do want to talk about to spiritual practice and self-study is, just like I said earlier, the difficulty of it. The difficulty sharpens our skills. It's kind of like, in order to make a diamond, there's going to be a lot of pressure. A pearl is born by irritation. Yeah? A piece of sand irritating inside the oyster turns into a pearl. So we kind of have to see that the difficulty is sharpening our sword, sharpening our skills. So we kind of, in a way, be thankful and grateful for the difficulties. Because without them, we probably wouldn't be able to walk the path. We wouldn't be able to see how, without the difficulties, we wouldn't really grow or develop like we need to. So I'm not saying at the beginning that, yeah, you're going to be grateful for it. At first, it's going to feel like you hate it. There's absolutely no way my attitude will ever change towards it. My relationship towards the difficulty is always pain. And it's very hard to see how that can ever change. But in the long run, we have to allow ourselves for that possibility, to keep it in the back of our heads that that's a thing, to be aware of that. We got to give it all we got, despite the difficulty. So being a spiritual practitioner takes a lot. It's a lot of self-study, as I'm kind of piggybacking off the last video I did about self-study. It takes a dedication, a certain motivation, an inner flame that has to spark. There's a lot of resistances to self-study and to being a spiritual practitioner. We end up judging it as selfish. We think it won't do any good, and then it's very difficult. But being a spiritual practitioner is a matter of tackling these obstacles and understanding the enemy better than we understand ourselves, to the point where we see that this enemy is it's not even a real thing. The falseness dissipates, it burns up in the face of the truth. And that's how it happens, being a spiritual practitioner. John Dominique, the Soul Proponent.